They didn't look at me when they placed the photos on the table. Just slid them across the smooth wood, one after the other, like cards in a game I hadn't agreed to play. "Here you are," one said. "Walking unaided. Grocery store parking lot, 2 weeks ago." Another photo, me at the hardware store, carrying a single bag of cement. Another, sitting on a bench at the city park, stretching, leg crossed. "Seems like a man doing just fine," the man in the tie said. There was no cruelty in his voice, just something worse. That polite detachment people use when they've already decided who you are. I didn't answer. They went on. Talked about discrepancies. Re-evaluation of aid. Observed behaviors inconsistent with declared impairment. I kept my eyes on the photos. Noticed the angle, the grain. Surveillance, not curiosity. A lens aimed at me on the wrong days, days when the pain dulled just long enough to move without wincing, when I chose to walk because the stillness hurt more. Behind them sat a man in uniform. Not active duty. Clean-pressed blazer, no insignia. He watched me carefully. Clipboard in hand. Legs crossed. Civilian now, but still carried his posture like armor. I didn't speak until they asked the question outright. "Mr. Kellerman, can you demonstrate the impairment that qualifies you for your current disability benefits?" I nodded once. Reached down. Unbuckled the strap with my left hand, slowly, because the joint had stiffened from the cold. The click echoed in the small room. I rolled the pant leg up past the knee. Then, with both hands, I lifted the prosthetic free. The man in the uniform stopped writing. I set it gently on the table, right on top of their photographs. The emblem was there, worn but intact. My old unit, 173rd Airborne, etched in steel and scuffed by sand. They went quiet. All of them. And in that silence, I sat back. Not angry. Not ashamed. Just tired. Let me know what to adjust. When you approve this, I'll continue to part 2, flashback with a full 5,000 character depth. I came from a line of men who served, but never said much about it. My grandfather, James Kellerman, fought in France. Had a bayonet scar that ran the length of his calf, though I only saw it once. My father, Harold, served in Vietnam. Came home with a limp and a silence that settled between his words like dust in a long-abandoned room. We never talked about the wars. But the flag never came down from the porch, not even in storms. I joined the army the summer after I turned 18. No ceremony, no applause. Just a handshake from my old man and a ride to the recruitment office in his beat-up Chevy. He didn't say much, just pulled the truck into the lot and said, "If you're going to do it right." Fort Benning shaped me. Or stripped me, maybe. Took the soft edges and filed them flat. I wasn't the best shot. Not the fastest runner. But I listened. I learned. I didn't crack under pressure, and that's what they needed. By the end of my first tour in Afghanistan, I was a staff sergeant leading 8 men, boys, most of them, with barely enough facial hair to fool a razor. We worked through the Ghazni corridor, ran route security, cleared compounds. We built outposts in valleys where no man had business sleeping. And we buried friends. Quietly. One at a time. The second tour felt heavier. The terrain hadn't changed, but we had. There were new recruits. Replacements. Some of them thought war was like in the movies. It took a week to show them otherwise. I'd watched their faces change after their first firefight, when they realized bullets don't pause for fear, that the smell of blood is worse than the sight of it. Then came July 17th, south of Kandahar. We were escorting a supply convoy through a dusty pass. Roads pitted with erosion and old IED scars. I was walking the lead vehicle on foot when the blast came. Pressure plate buried under a pile of goat bones, rigged to detonate with directional force. It felt like the ground split in half beneath me. Noise, then light. Then nothing. They said I was lucky. The blast caught me low, took most of both legs below the knees. Had I been 2 feet closer, they said, there'd be nothing to recover. When I came to, I was on a gurney, mouth dry, hands strapped down. My body didn't register pain, only absence. Like waking up and knowing something is gone before the room tells you what. At Landstuhl, I counted the days with painkillers and ceiling tiles. No one visited those first weeks, and I didn't ask for anyone. I focused on breath. On the feel of the sheets. On the shape of a future I hadn't chosen. Walter Reed came next. The therapists were good people. They asked gentle questions, and I gave quiet answers. Mostly, I nodded. There's a loneliness in injury they don't talk about, not the solitude of the room, but the isolation of being watched like a project, not a man. They fitted me with prosthetics by October. Titanium sockets, carbon fiber blades. High-end. Responsive. I learned to walk again. Slowly. With mirrors on either side, like I was being rebuilt from memory. Pain was constant. Phantom pain worse. My legs had been gone for months, but they still screamed. At night, I'd sit on the edge of the bed, sockets off, sweat on my back, wondering how something that isn't there can still feel like it's burning. I didn't tell anyone. When I was discharged, I went home to Omaha. Margaret met me at the airport. She didn't flinch when she saw me. Just walked up and took my bag. Said, "Let's go home," and that was the first time I cried since the blast. We got married the following spring. She never treated me like I was broken. She adjusted her pace to mine. Laughed when I made jokes about having low overhead. And on the days when I couldn't put the prosthetics on because the skin had blistered or the socket rubbed raw, she'd bring coffee to the couch and sit beside me, saying nothing. The VA process was long. The paperwork dense. But eventually, I was granted a full disability rating. The documents detailed my loss in percentages and codes. But I never felt like a number. Not with Margaret. Not in our home. I tried to stay active. On my good days, I walked the dog, ran errands, even helped build a ramp for the neighbor who'd been hurt in a farming accident. Some people saw a man moving on. But they didn't see the hour it took to dress. The ointment for cracked skin. The shaking hands after 10 minutes upright. I never expected a parade. Never wanted sympathy. But I expected decency. I believed, maybe naively, that the country I served wouldn't question what I left behind. I was wrong. The letter arrived in mid-September, folded twice inside a government envelope that looked no different from the rest: pension updates, appointment reminders, tax notifications. But this one was different. It said my benefits were under review. That new information had surfaced suggesting a reassessment of medical necessity. I read it once. Then again. The words didn't change. My stomach turned cold. There was a number to call. I did. Spoke to a voice that sounded half asleep, half automated. They confirmed, someone had submitted surveillance footage. The case was flagged. A man named Brooks would be handling it. Brooks came to the house the following week. Mid-30s. Cheap shoes. Eyes that stayed too long on things that weren't important, pictures on the wall, the worn carpet by the front door, the marks on my walking stick. He shook my hand like he was doing me a favor. Said it was routine. Said they had to confirm eligibility given recent activities. He smiled. A practiced one. The kind that doesn't reach the eyes. He asked if I was still experiencing pain. I nodded. He asked if I walked unassisted. Sometimes, I said. On good days. Flat surfaces. With rest after. He jotted notes. I watched the pen, not his face. Have you performed any heavy lifting recently? I said I'd carried a bag of salt to the porch before the last snow. 5 pounds. Maybe 6. He nodded, kept writing. When he left, I felt something small and unseen shift inside the house. As if I'd been measured and found inconvenient. The second letter came 2 weeks later. My benefits were frozen pending further investigation. They cited photographic evidence. No hearing. No conversation. Just silence where assistants used to be. Margaret called the office. Waited on hold for an hour. They said we'd been notified. She asked if they'd read the doctor's letter, if they understood how prosthetic use varies by day, by swelling, by skin condition. They didn't answer. The photos came next. Laid out in front of me like accusations. One showed me at the grocery store, pushing a cart. Another showed me walking to the hardware store. One captured me in the park, sitting on a bench, rubbing my knee. Evidence of mobility, Brooks said during our second meeting. Substantially improved functionality. He didn't mention that all those photos were taken in 1 week. The only good week I'd had in months. He didn't mention the 6 hours I spent in bed afterward, or the way the prosthetic socket tore the skin above my tibia, reopening an old pressure wound. I asked if he'd reviewed my physical therapy reports. He said the images were more compelling. Compelling. That was the word he used for pain caught in good lighting. They had no images of me crawling to the bathroom at 3 a.m. No videos of Margaret soaking gauze in antiseptic when infection flared. No record of the days I couldn't wear the prosthetics at all and had to use the wheelchair just to get from one room to another. None of that made it into their file. They asked if I'd like to dispute the claim. I said I would. They scheduled a meeting. Told me to bring any materials I believed relevant. So I brought my leg. Not the one I was wearing. The one I kept in the closet. Older, heavier. Worn through from years of service and repair. The one with the emblem etched deep into the side, the 173rd Airborne, faded from sun and dirt. Margaret asked if I wanted company. I told her no. This wasn't a thing that required a witness. It required memory. I drove to the office myself. Took the elevator with people who looked at me, then looked away. The receptionist pointed me to room 204. Said, "They're expecting you," like it was a dentist appointment. Inside were 3 people. Brooks. Another man in a tie. And one in uniform, retired, judging by the cut of his hair and the way he sat like his back was still accountable to someone. They didn't shake my hand. Didn't ask how I was doing. They just showed me the photos again. Slid across the desk like playing cards. No preamble this time. "Mr. Kellerman," Brooks said, "can you demonstrate your condition for the record?" I looked at him. Then down at the images. Then I reached down, gripped the strap on my socket, and unfastened it. The click echoed against the sterile walls. I rolled my pant leg up. Lifted the prosthetic off. Placed it on the table beside their photos. The scars were visible. Red, puckered. The skin discolored from years of pressure and friction. I didn't speak. They didn't either. The man in uniform, Colonel, maybe, stopped writing. His eyes stayed fixed on the emblem. I sat back in the chair, empty socket resting against the floor. The silence in the room wasn't awkward. It was honest. None of them said a word. Not right away. The man in uniform, Colonel Ames, according to the tag on his folder, rested his pen on the table. His gaze dropped to the prosthetic. His eyes held there longer than I expected. It wasn't the kind of look you give a piece of evidence. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. Or memory. I don't think he was in Afghanistan. But he'd been somewhere. You can always tell. Not from ribbons. From the pause. The way their hands still half-clench at silence. Brooks glanced at him, waiting for the next move. When it didn't come, he cleared his throat. We can call in a medical consultant to verify. Ames didn't look at him. You think that's necessary? Brooks shifted in his seat. I believe our documentation suggested. You've got photographs, Ames said. You've got a prosthetic leg with a combat unit emblem, scar tissue that doesn't fake itself, and a man sitting here without a single word of exaggeration. His voice was flat. Professional. But there was a firmness in it that silenced the room more effectively than any shout. Brooks opened his mouth again but thought better of it. I sat quietly. Let them fill the air. Margaret had once told me that truth doesn't argue, it waits. It stands still and lets the noise wear itself out. I've learned that's the only way to make it heard. So I waited. A nurse practitioner named Lena came in 10 minutes later. Young. Sharp-eyed. She asked permission before approaching. I nodded. She examined the residual limbs with practiced hands, murmured to herself as she documented skin breakdown, limited range of motion, and surgical scarring consistent with post-traumatic limb loss. Patient demonstrates significant impairment, she said, addressing the table. Phantom pain, limited prosthetic tolerance, documented history of infection. Recommendation, continued assistance. She turned to me. Do you want help reattaching? I shook my head. She paused. Then added, thank you for your service, softly. Not performative. Just real. Then she left. Brooks tapped his pen against his notepad. A quiet rhythm, like he was trying to find a beat he could still dance to. Colonel Ames finally turned to me. I apologize for the way this has been handled. I nodded. That was enough. I'll submit my recommendation today. There won't be another freeze. Your file will be flagged for protected status. This won't happen again. Brooks looked as if he wanted to disagree, but his voice had left him somewhere between the prosthetic and the nurse's report. I stood slowly, strapped the leg back on. Each movement familiar. Automatic. Not effortless. When I stood, I looked at the prosthetic still resting on the table. The older one. The one I'd brought not because I needed it, but because it bore the truth. The emblem, 173rd Airborne, was still there. Scratched, dulled, but unbroken. Ames watched me reach for it. You earned that, he said. I didn't answer. Just nodded again. I walked out without looking back. Not because I didn't care. But because I didn't have to prove anything anymore. Outside, the air was colder than I'd expected. The sidewalk hummed beneath my steps. Each one a little uneven. That's the thing about prosthetics, they can mimic your gait, not your pain. At the curb, someone called my name. It was a young man. Hispanic. Mid-20s. Short haircut, broad shoulders, an old 10th Mountain patch on his coat. Are you Staff Sergeant Kellerman? He asked. I nodded, cautious. I was in the waiting room. Heard your name. Saw what happened. He hesitated. You shut them down. Without even raising your voice. I didn't know what to say. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded paper. It was his disability assessment. They're doing the same thing to me. Told me if I can walk to the bus, I can work construction. I looked at the form. Saw the language. Knew it by heart. I didn't know we could push back, he said. Didn't think anyone would listen. You don't have to shout to be heard, I said. You just have to show them the truth. And not blink when they try to look away. He nodded slowly. Thank you, Sergeant. I walked away before the silence broke the moment. That evening, back home, I placed the old prosthetic on a shelf in the garage. Wiped the dust from the emblem. I didn't feel triumphant. Just steady. Like a man who had finally been seen. 2 days later, I got a call from Colonel Ames. His voice was direct but carried none of the formality from the hearing room. He said the review panel had formally closed the case. Full benefits reinstated. A letter of apology was en route, along with certification that my file would be marked exempt from future non-medical reviews. I don't usually make these calls, he added. But I thought you ought to hear it from someone who understood what it meant. I thanked him. Not out of politeness, out of relief. A rare kind. The kind that doesn't celebrate. Just exhales. Later that week, a man in a blazer came to my door. He wasn't from the insurance board. He introduced himself as a consultant hired for training reform. Said he'd been brought on after the Kellerman review. They were overhauling how veteran disability cases were handled, starting with mandatory education on prosthetics, pain fluctuation, and the psychological cost of visible and invisible injuries. He handed me a folder. Inside were copies of the new policy draft. Language I never thought I'd see: recognition of intermittent function, patient-centered verification, respectful inquiry protocols. They'd even added a clause: no physical surveillance of veterans without judicial oversight. I read every word. It didn't fix everything. But it was a start. A week after that, another envelope came. Hand-delivered by a liaison officer. Inside was a framed document, a formal apology signed by the Oversight Board. Alongside it was a smaller letter, handwritten. From Ames. You reminded the room what sacrifice looks like. That emblem on your prosthetic, that stopped the conversation because it meant something real. It stood in for every man and woman who ever came back changed, and had to prove it to strangers. You shouldn't have had to do it. But because you did, others might not have to. I read it twice. Then tucked it beside Margaret's photo on the mantel. The young veteran I'd met outside the building, Luis, I heard from him too. He sent an email. Said he'd filed an appeal. Sent in medical records and a statement. Quoted something I'd told him: you don't have to shout to be heard. He said the board listened. His benefits were restored. And he was planning to volunteer as a peer advocate. Ames told me, during that last call, that something strange happened after the hearing. Veterans, dozens of them, began contacting the office. Not to file complaints. Just to say they'd heard. That they were grateful. That they'd felt alone in the system until someone sat quietly and made them feel visible again. I didn't speak at those meetings. I didn't have to. My prosthetic had said enough. Its emblem, worn by time and battle, had become something more than a mark. It had become a mirror, reflecting not just what was lost, but what still stood. 3 weeks passed before I stepped back into the VA center. Not because I was avoiding it. Just needed time to feel the ground under me again. To move through the world without the weight of someone else's doubt on my back. It was early, not quite 8 a.m. The waiting room was still half empty. Chairs lined in rows, a few heads bowed over forms, a cough from the back corner. The same fluorescent hum in the ceiling, the same institutional beige. But something felt different. The receptionist looked up when I approached. Her eyes widened slightly, then softened. You're Mr. Kellerman, right? I nodded. She smiled, small but certain. We've heard a lot about you lately. She stood up and handed me a folder. You're on the advisory list now. Volunteer peer program. Some folks asked if you'd be willing to talk to them. I opened the folder. Inside was a schedule. A few names. Brief notes. Veteran, 38, amputation, left below knee. Recent denial. Requesting support. Gulf War, PTSD, Mobility Review. Considering appeal. Vet. Liaison requested Kellerman specifically. I sat down slowly in one of the chairs by the window. The morning light hit the floor in narrow beams, dust suspended in it like memory. By 10, I'd met with 2 men. One was my age, but looked older. Carried his injury like a secret he never meant to speak aloud. He didn't say much. Just looked at the outline of my prosthetic and then at the chair where I'd set my old one down beside me. "You too?" he asked. I nodded. That was all we needed. The second man, Luis, showed up just after noon. Same coat, same nervous hands. He smiled when he saw me, eyes still guarded but steadier than before. "They listened," he said. "I didn't think they would. But they did." He sat across from me, holding a paper like it was breakable. "Full benefits. Appeal granted." "I brought something," he said after a pause. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small patch. His unit. Not mine. A different war, a different road. "I was going to toss it," he said. "Didn't feel like I earned it anymore." He slid it across the table. "But I think I want to keep it now." I didn't touch it. Just looked at him and said, "You should." That afternoon, I met the new veteran liaison. A woman named Casey. Former Army nurse. Sharp, direct, no fluff. "We're changing how we train the intake staff," she said. "Empathy first." That's the phrase. Came straight from the review board. She paused, then added, "I read your file. What they put you through. It shouldn't have happened." I told her it did happen. That's why it mattered now. Casey nodded. "There's a line in the new manual, in uncertain cases, defer to service. That was your language. They quoted you." I didn't remember saying it. But maybe I had. Maybe it was just something I believed without needing to write it down. At home, Margaret's photo sat beneath the letter Ames had written. Some nights I looked at it and just sat still. She would have liked the way it ended. Not with outrage, not with retribution, but with correction. There was talk of a panel. Someone wanted me to speak. I declined. I told them if they needed a face for their paperwork, they already had one, etched in steel on the side of a prosthetic leg, worn by sand and years, never by shame. Instead, I kept showing up. Thursday mornings became my routine. Coffee in a thermos, notebook in my coat pocket, the same chair by the window. No name tag. No speeches. Just presence. Veterans would come in, see me, and if they wanted to talk, they sat. If not, I nodded and left it there. One man, Vietnam, double amputee, came just to sit beside me in silence for 20 minutes. Then he stood, shook my hand, and left. Never said a word. Didn't need to. There's something about being seen. Not for the worst day of your life, but for what you carried through it. For the quiet after. For the way you keep standing even when your legs are made of carbon and your sleep is made of ghosts. They hired 2 more advocates like me. One was a woman from the Gulf War. One a Marine who lost his arm in Fallujah. We met every 2 weeks. Compared notes. Swapped stories. Mostly listened. I told them once, half joking, that we were the unofficial guardrail of the system, there to catch what bureaucracy missed. "No," Casey said. "You're the spine. You remind us what stands, even after everything else falls." I didn't answer. But when I got home that day, I opened the shelf in the garage and took out my old leg. Not to use it. Just to look. The emblem was still there. Scuffed. Honest. A reminder. In places where doubt replaces honor, it sometimes takes one man's quiet courage to remind the world what sacrifice looks like. Not through anger. Not through noise. Just by setting down a prosthetic leg on a desk, and letting the emblem speak.